Welcome to this video breaking down the components of GDP. Let's jump into it. So we introduced this idea of gross domestic product that is one measure of trying to figure out what is the total amount of stuff that's produced in an economy in a particular year. Well, being a little bit more specific about how we come up with that number, we've got that the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA, will come up with a breakdown of what all of the stuff in an economy that's been, that money has been spent on. What are the different components of that? And so we have this expenditures approach that takes Y, which is the total economic output, that's overall GDP, can be broken up as C plus I plus G plus NX. And this is one of those equations that we end up remembering, even if we don't really want to, remembering at the end of our macroeconomics experience in this semester. So we've got Y equals, or output, GDP equals C plus I plus G plus NX plus NX. And in this video, we're going to break down each one of those different components. So again, the entire goal here is we are taking the expenditures approach, which is how much money is spent in the economy on final goods and services in the economy. So the reason that we say the expenditures approach is because we have kind of every transaction will have two sides. So if we go to a coffee shop and we buy a cup of coffee, there is the money that was spent on that cup of coffee, like $6 for a latte. We pay $6. That is the expense, or how much was spent on that cup. And then the $6 that the company receives, or that the coffee shop receives, that is income to that company. That is income to that coffee shop. So we've got the $6 that was spent, we've got the $6 that is income. And so really that same sort of idea we can use when we're thinking about calculating GDP or calculating output. We can try to sum the total amount of money that was spent, so the spending or the expenditures in a particular economy, so the expenditures approach, or we could try to sum up what the overall income is in the economy. So in this case right now, we're just looking at how much money was spent. So we're taking a look at the expenditures approach, breaking it up as C, I, G, and NX. So let me just introduce what those terms are real quick. So C is going to be consumption, right? So private consumption, but C is consumption. I is going to be investment. And we're going to break down these, there's a lot of words here for every one of these sections, so we are going to break it down even further. We've got G is government spending, government purchases, and NX is going to be net exports. So those are the four components in a nutshell. Let's dive and take a look at each one of them. So when we say C, this is private consumption. The one thing to know is that this is definitely the largest component of GDP. And this is really all the final goods and services that households buy. Final goods and services that households buy. This is going to account for about 68 to 70%. So really about 78, or really about 70%, but kind of fluctuates year to year. So we give a little bit of a range there. But definitely know that consumption is the largest of the components. Okay, goods are going to be physical stuff that we buy. We're going to have things that we consume or use up within about 3 years. So some examples are going to be tacos, clothing, school supplies, etc. These are going to be goods that are non-durable. So non-durable goods are going to be things that we consume or use up. They are not going to be around for all that long, but those are non-durable goods. Again, just like textbook definition type stuff, versus durable goods are ones that are going to last longer than 3 years. So they're just going to be around for a little while. There's going to be things like cars, lots of home appliances, things like that. So those are goods. Services, on the other hand, are going to be intangibles that are provided to consumers. So this is going to be like a checkup at the doctor, or legal services, or something like tutoring services. So if we go and get some one-on-one private tutoring, or you book a private tutoring session with me, or even really you just having a GPA Factory membership, those things are going to be considered services. Okay, all of those are going to be considered parts of private consumption. There's a lot of citizens in the country. There are lots of things that people buy, both durable and non-durable goods, as well as services. And so that is why that's considered the largest of the components. So a little bit of a GPA Factory tip here is what is not included in GDP. So things that we do not include are going to be used goods, intermediate goods, because we want to avoid double counting. When we think about used goods, so if we're looking at the GDP, it's going to be the market value of final goods and services produced in an economy for a particular year. So if we've got that Ford makes a car, Ford makes a car and then sells that car in, let's just kind of rewind a few years and say sells the car in 2019. Okay. That car, let's say, is produced and then sold in 2019. And then the next year, it was resold. Okay. The next year in 2020, it was resold. We don't want to count the production in 2020 for that car because we've already counted it in 2019. So if it's a used good, we're not going to include it as part of production in that next year because we don't want to double count. Same thing with intermediate goods. So intermediate goods is, let's say that we're looking at the production of shoes. Okay? And there's like a lot of rubber and leather and laces and all of that stuff that Nike is going to pay for or pay their employees to make that stuff. We've got all of those different intermediate goods or those components that Nike spends money on. Then they make a pair of shoes and they sell the shoes for $150. Well, only the $150 is going to be included in GDP because we would be double counting if we included all of the laces, the rubber, the leather, as well as that final product of the shoe, because all the the laces, the leather, the rubber, all of that is already built into that $150 price. So we exclude used goods and intermediate goods, and that is going to be our consumption component of GDP. Now we get into investment. This is going to account for about 18 to 20%. 18 to 20% is going to be included as investment. And again, this fluctuates year to year. You don't have to know exactly the exact dollar amount there because it does change. But just know that it is kind of tied with or about the same size as government spending or government purchases, but it is going to be a smaller component than consumption. And this investment spending is going to be composed of a few different pieces. So investment spending can be broken up into these three broad categories, 1, 2, and 3. So 3 major components here are going to be fixed business investment. So this is going to be basically companies. So companies spending money on buildings, on machinery, on equipment, even something like if we were starting our own bar and we had to buy, a bar and some bar stools as investment for that business that's going to be around for a while, that would be considered fixed business investment. If we had to buy, a lot of pitchers, we're going to sell pitchers of beer, then those pitchers, we buy 100 different pitchers that are all glass, those would also be considered fixed business investment. So it's kind of defined here, new factories for a company, new machinery, new equipment, all of that stuff would be considered fixed business investment. This is going to include any money that the firm spends to maintain or to expand their business, also known as business spending. So just really when companies are trying to invest money into their business for stuff that they're going to have around for a while, that's fixed business investment. The other one, second component here of investment spending in the US is residential investments. And you're like, residential investments, that sounds kind of complicated. It's really just new homes. So new homes tend to increase in value over time, so it's not going to be part of consumption spending. That is one component, kind of, nice to point out that is one component that is purchased by households that is not part of consumption spending. So households do purchase new homes, but that's going to be included in investment spending because those tend to increase in value over time. So if a home is then resold, though, kind of the same idea here, we're not going to include used goods. Home is resold, it does not add value to the value of GDP. We are only including the value of new homes. And now we've got this idea of change in business inventories. So companies increasing or decreasing the amount of stuff that they have on the shelves or in their warehouses or on their lots from year to year. When I say lots, this is going to be kind of like a car lot, for a Ford or a Chevrolet or something. And when I mean increases in inventories, let's say that Chevrolet has 10 trucks, in their lot. We're just simplifying it right now. We're saying that maybe Chevy only has 10 trucks in year 1 on their lot. And then they make a bunch of trucks. Let's say that they make 100, but they sell only 90 throughout year 2. Right? They make 100, but they sell only 90. That means that they added 10 to their inventory so that now they have 20 trucks at the end of year 2 in their inventory. There was that increase in inventories. So that's what we mean by change in business inventories, is the change in the amount of products or stuff that's on the shelves. So during year 2, if we made or produced 100, right, but then we only sold 90, that increase in inventories of 10 is also going to be added to GDP in the form of investment spending. So this amount that we sold, those 90, that would actually be part of consumption spending because that was, produced and sold in year 2. But then that extra 10, right? We made 100, we only sold 90, so that added 10 that's getting added to the lot, that would be included as change in business inventories. So hopefully that makes sense there. Those are the 3 components of investment spending. And we can move on to government spending here. So government purchases is going to be almost all the money that the government spends. There's going to be a couple of things that we exclude that I mentioned down below. But this is going to account for about, it's about 15 to 20%. We'll just make that range a little bit big because it does kind of fluctuate year to year. In some years, like COVID, the amount of government purchases or how much money the government spends is a lot larger. So it really does fluctuate year to year. This is going to include all local, state, and federal spending. And the government usually has to receive something in return for what they are paying. So the government pays for a bridge or pays professors or makes military purchases. All of those would be considered government purchases or part of government spending. So it's really all of the money that the government spends when it's purchasing something. But things that are not included are going to be what is called transfer payments. So this is a big concept that's talked about at various times in this course, but this is really just the money. This is really just money that the government gives out. It's almost like a handout. So money that the government distributes to people, but it doesn't really get anything in return. So some examples are going to be like Social Security or unemployment benefits. The government is just transferring from itself into the hands of individuals or companies. Those transfer payments are not going to be added to GDP. So they're not part of that government purchases because the government's not really getting anything in return. There's no like productive capacity that's going on there. Okay, then we get to this component. The last component of breaking down our government spending is net exports. So this is going to be the value of all the country's exports minus the value of what they import. So when we say net exports, it's going to be exports minus imports. And really this is like a correction factor. So what I mean by this being a correction factor is when we first introduced the concept of GDP, I'm just going to draw a really terrible United States here. Kind of bear with me. We've got Florida. We go up to Maine. Okay. So it kind of looks like a whale, but we've got the United States is hanging out. And remember what we said, that what gets added to the United States GDP is stuff that was produced here, even if it was sold or purchased abroad. So we might have a car that was produced in Nebraska, right? So we have this car that was produced in Nebraska, but then it was sold elsewhere. Well, it's not really going to hit the consumption spending like C item in terms of the amount of money that was spent in the economy, but that needs to get added to the US GDP. It was a new car that was purchased elsewhere, and so because it was purchased elsewhere, that's called an export. So exports are things that were produced in the United States, if we're taking the perspective of the US, but it's produced within that country. So exports are produced within that country, so they should add to GDP, but they were spent, there was money that was spent on them elsewhere. So that export is going to add positively to net exports and therefore positively to GDP, whereas something that was imported, right? Maybe a t-shirt was imported. That import of the t-shirt would probably be added to consumption spending, but we actually need to subtract it off because it was produced outside of the United States and then, money was spent on it in the United States, but those imports we actually have to subtract off because it was not produced within the United States. Okay, so that is the idea of exports and imports. It's really like a correction factor that we are accounting for, but we add exports minus imports. And really this is going to account for a negative component. So know that this is the only generally negative component. It hasn't always been the case every single year in the United States or anything, but generally we run a trade deficit. This is going to account for about -4 to -5% of GDP. So again, these numbers kind of fluctuate year to year, but -4 to -5, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller than that, but it is the only component there that is negative. So when exports are greater than imports, that means that we export more than we import. That means that we run a trade surplus. A trade surplus. When exports are greater than imports. When exports are less than imports, we run a trade deficit. When exports are less than imports, we run a trade deficit. Because of that negative component that we just talked about, generally in the United States, we do run a trade deficit. And again, that just means that we're importing more than we export. But those are all the different components of GDP. Again, total output, total GDP in the economy is going to be broken up into the 4 component pieces, which we will talk about a lot throughout this entire course. And that's consumption spending, investment spending, and those different components under investment spending, government purchases, and net exports. So that'll do it for this video. We will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching that GPA Factory video. Hopefully that was extremely helpful. If you found it to be helpful or to kind of clarify some of that content, you can also have access to a free month of membership if you follow this link and use the code YouTube100. Now with the GPA Factory membership, you'll have access to weekly review sessions that are 1 to 2 hours posted every single week that come with practice questions to help you along with your studies and have video solutions to those. In addition, it'll include an exam review as we get closer to the exam that'll have even more practice questions and video solutions to those given out as well. You also have 24/7 access to our question wall if you get stuck while you're studying, and you get discounts on private tutoring. So if all of that sounds great, again, go to this link and use the code YouTube100 to learn from one of the best to ever teach this course. That's me. So try it out, see if you like it, and yeah, we'll see you around. Thanks.